Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We are starting part 1 or part 4 of a series, depending on how you're looking at it. We are addressing this need for an international truth commission related to the transatlantic slave trade. In doing so, we're going to be looking at the history of the kingdom of Dahomey. Now, of course, we've touched on this before, but we're going to delve into it a little bit more. This includes looking at a little bit of the history of Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, Burkina Faso, and of course current day Benin. Now we're also going to be looking at this issue again of writing Africa out of history in terms of the Bible or scripture. So we're going to be looking at this dynamic of historical revision. We're going to look at that history of Benin and Dahomey in relation to the transatlantic slave trade. We're also going to touch on the dynamic of this apology that has been issued from Benin to individuals in the United States who are understood as descendants of those who've been enslaved in the United States. We're going to look at how this apology was very general and why it needs to be a little bit more specific and why it hasn't been any more specific. We're going to look at an unusual dynamic that we've touched on before, which is related to brainwashing that was conducted by Dahomey on those who were enslaved. We're going to look at this in addition to this ritualistic desecration of human life during the slave trade and the actual desecration of the land of the neighboring kingdom. And in doing all of this, we are going to look at some historical evidence related to the identity of that neighboring kingdom and why it is so important to have a truth commission related to this transatlantic slave trade. And as always, if this appears on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. We are going to start with a very unique point of departure related to this discussion. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this piece of musical theater that's from 1903. This piece of musical theater was created by those understood as Black or Negro or colored during that time. They created this piece and also performed in this piece. And so this was a historical moment in terms of musical theater for those who were identified as colored, Negro, Black in America. The lyrics for the musical theater came from Paul Laurence Dunbar. This is a very interesting piece of musical theater because the title of it is In Dahomey, and it tells the story of these two con men from Boston who found this pot of gold, and they devised a plan. It's hard to know why they devised this plan, but they devised this plan to colonize the African kingdom or country of Dahomey, and that is present-day Benin. And this colonizing was supposed to take place by a group of poor American Blacks. And so you can see this is a very odd story, a very odd narrative, and you can see some of the parts of the musical theater that took place. And so you can see the Jonah Man, My Castle on the Nile, things like that. And so we're going to go into this and why this is such an unusual dynamic and why these individuals might have been even thinking about Dahomey during this period of time in America. Now, there's a little bit of a backstory to consider related to this piece of musical theater. The story involves what was identified as an old Southern Negro by the name of Lightfoot, and he was the president of the Dahomey Colonization Society. Now, Lightfoot was related to a place called Gatorville in Florida. Now, this story goes that these individuals decided that they were going to participate in colonizing the kingdom of Dahomey. And they went to Dahomey with hopes of colonizing Dahomey, and they became governors of this province. One of the things that happened, though, in the story is that there was a misunderstanding and these colonizers became prisoners. One of the things that they note is that prisoners and criminals were executed on what was known as the Customs Day in Dahomey. Now, they were able to convince the king by giving rum to release these prisoners, these colonists. And what they came away with was this idea of there's no place like home. What's unclear, however, is do they mean there's no place like home, meaning America, or do they mean there's no place like home, meaning Dahomey? We'll get into why this may have been possible, this question may have been possible in the first place as we go along. The Kingdom of Dahomey has received significant attention related to its role in the transatlantic slave trade, and there's a big reason for that. Dahomey, now Benin, played a pivotal role in the transatlantic slave trade, and in fact, the area that Benin currently occupies, that area eventually became known as the Slave Coast. While many people have noted that Benin has made an apology for the transatlantic slave trade, for its involvement in it, there is a little bit of a conflict in terms of these apologies. On one hand, the apologies have been issued, but they tend to be tied to issues of commerce and tourism, and so Benin is no exception. So you've had this come out of Ghana with this tying of the apology to commerce, and so it brings up the question of the authenticity of the apologies. Now, questions related to the authenticity of the apology come from issues related to Benin's pivotal role in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. So on one hand, you have the country issuing this apology across the water here, and at home in Benin, you still have this dynamic where they have statues of Felix de Souza, who was instrumental in the transatlantic slave trade. You have this dynamic where you have a country where for over 200 years you had these powerful kings in this country, now known as Benin. They were involved in capturing individuals and selling individuals into slavery. They were selling individuals to the Portuguese, to the French, and to British merchants. Not only were they selling men and women, but they were also capturing and selling small children. These people would be gagged and jammed into boats that were bound for specifically Brazil, Haiti, and the United States. You also have this dynamic in Benin where the enslavers are still elevated and their descendants, and there is often what is considered a lack of regard for, right in Benin, the descendants of those who were enslaved. Now, some people think that these apologies just started because many people had never even heard of the fact that Benin or any other place had made an apology. However, you can see from this 2003 article that the apology started quite a while ago. And so the ambassador for Benin came to the United States and provided an apology for slavery at Southern University. And Southern University is located in Louisiana in Baton Rouge. And as the article points out, at that time, Benin was comprised of approximately 5 million people, and it was known as Dahomey during the 17th century. Dahomey, again, was this major supplier of enslaved people, and they enslaved approximately 3 million people in terms of the slave trade. In addition to questions related to the authenticity of the apology, there are questions related to the exact dynamics that took place in terms of the slave trade in Benin. These dynamics went beyond what would be considered a commercial enterprise. And so in this dynamic with Dahomey and enslavement, you had slave traders rounding up people and sometimes catching them in nets. And this catchment area, strangely enough, it extended far beyond the west coast of Africa, and it went into what's known as Ethiopia and the Sudan. And in many instances, enslaved individuals who were trapped, they were forced to walk in chains hundreds of miles to what's known as Juda or Juda. And once they got there, they underwent this unusual process of brainwashing. And as you can recall, we discussed this before. What happened was the individuals were marched down to this area and they were made to march around this magical tree that was called the tree of forgetting or the tree of forgetfulness. Now, the men had to walk around 9 times, and there was another process for the women and children. They had to walk around this tree 7 times. The idea behind this was that the individuals were to experience a dynamic where they forgot who they were, they forgot their names, their families, they forgot their total history. Not only this, but individuals were then locked in a dark room that was supposed to resemble part of the ship, and it was known as this place where there is no light. Now, many people might still say, well, this was really about slavery and a commercial enterprise. However, you have a dynamic where Benin was intentionally inducing what is known as psychosis. And so the question becomes, why would Benin be interested in having individuals who were enslaved not only be enslaved, but to undergo an intentional process of psychotic inducement? And so what we're talking about when we're looking at brainwashing and this dynamic of inducing psychosis that was going on in Benin, we're looking at, in addition to this physical slavery, we're looking at this process of inducing mental slavery. They were engaged in this dynamic of mental control, menticide, trying to engage in thought reformation. They were inducing the people to engage in a reduction in their very critical thinking. They were trying to make the people have an attitude change in their values, change in their beliefs. They were trying to make the people have this dynamic of forgetting who they actually were. The major question is exactly who or these people that Dahomey was so invested in terms of inducing psychosis. Why did they need to have this particular group of people, these enslaved individuals, why did they need to have them forget who they are, forget where they came from, forget their actual names, and forget their history? Why was this going on? The answer to that is that Dahomey, also known as Dahomey, was engaged in enslaving the historical biblical group known as the children of Israel, and specifically this group known as the Kingdom of Judah. Now, this Kingdom of Judah, as we've discussed before, has different iterations in terms of the spelling based upon the language. And so you have some groups that identify them as Judah, Judah, Juda, Yehuda, Weda, Fida, Weda, and Zuida. It just depends on the language that is being spoken. And of course, some people might question this or even question whether Dahomey understood that this was the identity of the people that they were enslaving. And the answer to that is of course they knew the identity, because the identity of Dahomey is actually Dahomey. And this comes from the tribe of Dan, which is also another group of individuals understood as the children of Israel. Based upon this narrative coming out of Benin, it seems clear that something more than a commercial enterprise was going on with respect to this kingdom of Judah or Zuida. And the narrative coming out of Benin is basically that in March of 1727, King Agaja, who was over Dahomey, mounted an attack on Zuida or Judah. And what happened in this attack was that they burned the capital of Judah down and then laid waste to Judah. And so not only were there approximately 11,000 individuals in prison, which would be consistent with the slave trade, what you had here was this ritualistic slaughtering of 5,000 individuals in the kingdom of Judah. Not only was there this ritualistic slaughtering of 5,000 individuals, children in that kingdom were used to slaughter the elders. And Benin goes on to say that in the palace complex, it was so politically significant that the individuals who were from the kingdom, they were forbidden in terms of resettling in any place in direct proximity to this palace. And taken together, it's clear that more than a commercial enterprise was going on with this conquering of Juda or Judah, with the subsequent occupation of that place by the kingdom of Dahomey, and this ritualistic slaughtering of the inhabitants of that kingdom. And of course, all of this plays into this dynamic of inducing psychosis in the individuals who actually were able to survive this. One of the things that happens when entities get colonized or there is imperialism going on is that identity gets lost, and so things get very confusing. And this is definitely the case in Africa, where you have these arbitrary geographic distinctions that have nothing to do with the historical realities of the people. And so, as you recall in our discussions related to Esau, you can see that Esau is spread out all over the globe, including in Africa, and Esau specifically is in this area that we are talking about. And so what you have in terms of this slave trade dynamic with Dahomey, Benin, you have this dynamic where Dan is colluding with what is understood as descendants of Esau, Edo. They are colluding or have colluded in the past against the entity known as Judah. And so you can see biblically, or if you're talking about scripture, you're talking about history, you can see that these entities are actually related, and of course they would know the identity of the people that they are neighboring. And so, long story short, you have a dynamic when you look at the old maps whereby this kingdom of Judah is basically flanked on both the right and the left by kingdoms related to Esau, and then at the top surrounded by Dan, and so sort of surrounded by these three entities, Esau on one side, Esau on another side, and then Dan at the top. And we're just going to revisit some old maps we've looked at before so that you can see how this dynamic played out back then. So you can see over to the left, you can see the kingdom of Judah over to the left, and you can see that it's bordered by the Euphrates River. You can also see Ardra up top there. Over to the right hand side, you can see the kingdom of Dahomey spelled a little different there, and you can see it's really inland. You can also see the kingdom of Judah when it is transformed to the slave coast. So the kingdom of Judah originally, when it was engaged in trading, was not initially identified as a slave coast. But you can see here where it is transformed into such, and you can see the kingdom of Benin off to the right. Now this is interesting because you have a country now named Benin, which is not the same as the kingdom of Benin, and then you have the kingdom of Dahomey, which is now the kingdom that is in the area that is now known as Benin. And so to clear all of this up, what you have is a dynamic whereby this kingdom of Judah was conquered by Dahomey, and then Dahomey moved into this kingdom, and now this would be considered a form of identity theft and ethnic cleansing, because the kingdom space has been taken over by another kingdom that is now identifying itself as belonging to that particular geographic space, and they've even maintained the name of Juda for that coastal area city. And so there is this dynamic of identity theft that is going on between the kingdom of Dahomey and that former kingdom of Judah. And here are a couple of other maps so that you can see the way things looked when the slave coast was totally transformed from the kingdom of Judah to simply the slave coast, which it was not initially. And then over to the right, you can see Dahomey and then the Juda coast, and that's just another way of saying Judah, and you can see that little map there. And this is another old map that depicts the kingdom of Dahomey and the slave coast. And so you can see on here, you see an indicator for the slave coast. You can see Juda, you can see Adra, you can even, toward the middle there, see the kingdom of Lagos. Now, most people now think of Lagos as simply a city in Nigeria, but you can see here that it was actually a kingdom at one time. One of the things that you need to make note of is this dynamic that we've talked about before of names for people and places, and then this giving you some idea of the history. This is definitely the case with Dahomey, whose original name is Dahomey, and it is named after their chief, whose name was Dan. This is known as an ethnonym, and so this is an ethnic group that has a name that is specific to that ethnic group, and it gives you the identity of that ethnic group. Now we're going to look at some slave trading records to show that the identity of that kingdom was understood across a number of cultures. So there's no mistaking in terms of who they thought that kingdom was. And so you have a number of slave ships named after the kingdom. Now, interestingly, this is a slave trading record here related to slave ships, and you can see the vessel name off to the left, and you can see Juda going down the line, and then you see Fida, which is another way of spelling this kingdom of Judah. You can see that the voyages began from every place, from Liverpool to Rhode Island to Newport to London. And then you can see the principal place of purchase of individuals, and you can see the Cape Coast Castle. You also see the initial place of enslavement being Juda again, and then Elmina. And what's important to note is the dates for the year that the enslaved individuals arrived at their location. And these dates are consistent with the overthrow of the kingdom of Judah and the aftermath in the 1700s. And as you might recall, the kingdom of Judah was first conquered by the Akan, and the Akan are known biblically as the grandchildren of Esau. And you can see here that this name of Judah was attached to a number of slave vessels, and you can see that this continued on until 1842. There's also an interesting outlier for 1580 going into a Spanish Americas port that's unspecified, and it's also coming out of an unspecified port in Africa. The majority, however, appear to be related to Brazil. And here we can see that after the kingdom was conquered by the Akan initially, you start to see slave vessels named Patriarch Jacob and Held Jacob. And here we have the profiles of two children who were enslaved but released by the international court. And so you have an 18-year-old whose name was Judah, and then you have a 12-year-old whose name was Levi. And you can see one was enslaved in Porto Novo, and then you can see one was enslaved in Bimbia. Now, Dr. Lisa Aubrey does some research on the relationship between Bimbia and enslavement of individuals who came to the United States. And you can see that even after slavery was made illegal, that in Porto Novo, coming out of that Bight of Benin, you can see that individuals were being enslaved with these Israelite sounding names. And so you have a Judah, you have Manasseh, you have Isaac, and you have all sorts of iterations of those names. Now we're going to look at this dynamic of monarch slave ships. In other words, slave ships that were named after a monarch. And in this instance, we're going to be looking at monarchs related to these African kingdoms. And so that you will know that you are actually looking at monarch slave ships, we're going to translate some of the titles so that you can get a better understanding of this. And so when you see Roy, that is king. And you see Reign, you see queen. And so these are French detected and Portuguese. So when you see the Roy before the name, you know that it is king of whatever comes after that, okay? Now that you've seen the translation, you can now understand the names of these particular vessels. And so you can see that after the conquering of the kingdom of Judah by Dahomey, you have slave vessels coming out of Juda, which would then be now Dahomey. You have slave vessels specifically identified as monarch slave vessels. So you have the king of Judah, the king of Judah, the queen of Judah, and prince of Judah. And these are going into places such as Haiti. So you can see Port-au-Prince and you can see St. Mark. And you can also see identified the place where the voyage began. And so that's very important also. And so you can see that this trade was taking place related to French territories. And so you can see coming out of France, you can see going to Haiti. And also it's important to note that there was significant trade going on between the Louisiana Territory and Haiti. Now, based upon the slave ship records, we were able to identify that a number of people with the name Judah or some sort of variation, they went to Freetown. We also see here when we do a surname analysis that the surname Judah is most prevalent in the United States. Its highest density, however, is in a surprising place known as Marshall Islands. Interestingly, the surname Judah has also been located in Indonesia, and these are depictions of people in different parts of Indonesia. Based upon this discussion, it's clear that an International Truth Commission is necessary in order to understand the totality of the transatlantic slave trade. This is necessary so that you can understand better the totality of the harm that took place. When this happens, you have a better idea of what would be needed for reparation. Now, some people believe that there should be a blanket apology and that reparations should be blanket. But as you can see, different people suffered different types of harm. And we need to have a better understanding of the different types of harm and the reasons for that harm before we jump to what type of apology needs to be made and what type of dynamic would constitute repair. Now, there have long been questions about the identity of individuals who were victims in the transatlantic slave trade. In this particular instance, when we're talking about this particular kingdom, there is a Latin phrase that we use in the law, and it's known as res ipsa loquitur, and it means the thing speaks for itself. And in this instance, the thing speaks for itself. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.